Johan of Moorhall, the year 874. 1. Johann picked his way over the fens, leather boots darting from one patch of grass to the next in a brisk run. As he passed, he made sure not to put too much weight on one foot or linger too long on one patch, else brown sludge would soak his feet through. He was making a long loop around his estate, surveying the grounds for wolves. His boy had sighted one the day before, but last night had been plagued with mist, and so it was a drinking night. This night was clear, and so he ranged. Like a true ranger, Johann was always prepared for wolves. He carried a two-edged sword strapped to his back, a long knife on one hip, and a short Sikh's knife on the other, with a longbow and quiver slung over his shoulder. Coming to stand at the bottom of a hill from which he could survey his lands, he stopped, his breath pouring white into the night air. The puffs rose up over a full moon of silver, pouring over the land and giving the moors below a vast rolling landscape of bristles and clods. The mounds and plains reminded him of an undulating sea, or unbeaten iron before the forge, both pleasing sights to his mind. He had seen the Severn Sea only once when he was a boy. Johann's father had taken him there on his way to business in Gloucester. Here, in west-central Mercia, outside the village of Wenlock, there were far from any glimpses of sea, but he did not mind. Johann was still young, only 20 years of age, and life was good. He had large fields of onions, peas, parsnips, and cabbage, a strong hall that stood through many winters, and a loyal woman who had borne him a boy and 2 daughters. He often helped his neighbors clear their farmlands of boars or wolves. Such beasts could kill children with ease, and often did, as the boys of the frontier village of Wenlock never missed a chance to prove themselves to their fathers. He was well respected in Wenlock, and the elders had urged him to take the position of reeve, but he preferred to live on the heaths outside the village, in his home they called Moorhall. Johann had even led men of Wenlock to raid the Welsh on occasion, since they were so close, their cattle so fat, and they often did the same. Beginning his ascent up the hill, he checked the brush that clung to both sides at the edges. It ran like an adder up the right side of the hill, in purple patches of heather and bramble, swaying gently in a chill breeze, bending low and advancing in a crouch. He moved swiftly to the brush line, gray eyes piercing through its darkness. Then a sound alerted him to the presence of a creature, and he drew his Sikhs, gripping it point down so that it was prepared to stab whatever lay within. A grassy clod rose up from the heather, speeding through the air to hit Johann in the side of the face. He sputtered, wiping dirt from his mustaches and spitting profusely. A round of giggles streamed up out of the brush, and he lunged forward with his free hand, pulling a pale arm up into the moonlight. His wife lurched to her feet, and once he saw her blue eyes, he let go. Wrapping arms around him, she continued to laugh. "I am sorry, my love," she whispered between chuckles. "It was just too tempting." "Elisa," Johann sighed, "I nearly spitted you like a boar." "Well, let's not rule anything out." The beauty with deep red braids kissed his rough, grimy cheek and pressed her head against his chest as she squeezed. He had been prepared to kill whatever lay in the heather, and the blood still pulsed in his temples. He should have been sorely cross, and many other men would have hit their wife for such a game, but he had never done so, and the sight of her was too much for him to resist. Taking her apple-shaped face in both hands, he kissed her deeply on the lips, sheathing his Sikhs as he did so. Moaning a little, her hands cradled his strong chin, nails dragging on his cheekbones, as he grunted softly. Bending low to the earth once more, he took her down with him, laying her back on the heather. Those bright eyes looked up at him in expectation as he tugged back her skirt, luminescent orbs filled with silver from above. Afterwards, he spoke first. "There is none to watch the children at this hour. We should return to the hall." His bare chest heaved a spout of white into the night air. She laid under his bare fur cloak, peeking up at him with scolding eyes. All day I watch the children and read to them the Gospels like a good Christian wife, while you teach farmers how to hunt. They cannot sit still for a minute because they are your children, you wild man. You go out every night after dinner and return when I am abed, thinking to steal some love. I cannot remain there all my life. I must walk out under the moon some nights, or I will die of such purgatory. Until you learn to hunt, your place is the home, and mine is the fields. If I knew how you felt about motherhood, perhaps I would not have sired them on you. Your father offered me 6 sheep to choose your sister. Why, yes, because... Elisa smiled. Well, have you seen her? So now I am a poor man with a pretty wife. You do well enough with your hunting and the work you do for farmers. They pay me in turnips. But you are well loved by them and all the townsfolk, and by the children and myself. Is that not enough? Johan stared off, over the crest of the hill, to the rolling countryside that stretched endlessly before them. Life was good, it was true, but there was always something more. Serving as Good Samaritan to the village could only bring him and his family so far. What would he leave behind for them when he was gone? Perhaps you are right, Elisa sighed. Let us return to the children. 2. They descended the great hill, overlooking Wenlock. A briskness added to their step. The smoke fires and the lights of the hamlet below faded from their gaze. Johan had done his best this eve to find the wolves. He had been out for hours. They were getting desperate now as the summer had sweltered the crops and early frosts had put an end to plant life in the moors. This meant their prey had starved for lack of food, and they too would be growing hungry as winter approached. The prospect of going to winter's sleep on an empty stomach was not a pleasant one. It was a wonder Elisa was able to find him so far afoot, he thought. Though he prided himself on stealth, she must have seen him coming, and hid in the low brush before he could glimpse her. At 16, his eyes had been sharp as an eagle, and every May festival was marked with him winning Wenlock's archery games. He wondered what had changed. As they covered the last few rises and falls of the hills, they speculated on what condition they would find their hall in. I put them to bed, Elisa defended herself. That does not mean they'll stay abed, Johan grumbled. It's true, little Johan may have eaten all the oatcakes by now. I can see him, Johan smiled, running naked to the waist, crumbs falling from his cheeks. Then they rounded the last bend before laying eyes on the hall. The hall was on fire. A half-dozen men stood in a half-circle around the hall, whose timbers had caught and cackled loudly. It was a hall he built himself, stripped the great boughs of oak and planed them with saws borrowed from village farmers. Hammered with wood nails and roofed with thatch, it had kept them warm for 6 years. The men's faces leered into the flames, eyes glowing with firelight, bearded men who clutched axes and spears. Johan's hand whipped out, pulling Elisa back behind the bend of a grassy mound. Elisa's eyes locked on Johan's in fright, her chin trembling, her small form shaking as she bent into him. Her nails tore into his fair forearms that held her steady and wrapped around to keep her from falling. A wheezing sound erupted from deep within her, and Johan moved to cover her mouth, wild gray eyes drawing her attention. He guided her to the earth and raised a finger to her lips, pressing it firm before turning away. Sidling up to the edge of the mound, Johan's nostrils flared as he tipped his head forward to see them. They were Danes, hair and beards wild and unkempt, some covered in tattoos, arms banded with gold and silver rings. Gnashing their teeth and howling like wolves before the inferno that rose up over Moorhall, Johan's eyes filled with water as he drew his longbow. Elisa, return to the hill we made love on, Johan whispered urgently. Hide in the heather as you did when I found you. Do not come out until you hear my voice. That is miles away, Elisa choked. I cannot leave you and our children. You must, Elisa, tears rolling down his cheeks. I am going to attack them, and if I fall, I cannot let them find you. We have lost enough today, but we must not lose each other. I will be after you once I kill these men. But I must attack them while our children still live, and I will not do so until you are gone. Now go. Elisa rose slowly to her feet and started to trudge away, looking back at Johan as tears spilled down her face. Johan turned back to the Danes, fitting an arrow to his bow. There were 4 spear Danes and 2 axe Danes, who looked similar, tall and broad-shouldered with braided blonde hair. These 2, who appeared as brothers, seemed to hold more authority. Their eyes were circled in tattoos of black ravens, and their axes were double-bladed, of fine tempered steel that shone in the moonlight. The spike atop each axe had a wolf's head carved into it. Johan had never seen such intricate craftsmanship. Johan decided they would die first. One brother bellowed at the flames, babbling in Danish and waving them larger with his axe blade. Johan's arrow hit him in the side of the neck, an impact that almost went unnoticed at first. Then a great paw rose up to slap at the quivering shaft, as if at a flying insect. When he found the arrow in his neck, he cried out, as warmth spread down his chain shirt and he fell to his knees, gasping for breath. His brother knelt at his side, screaming, "Harald!" and Johan knew that was his name. The brother barked at the spear Danes, who then advanced towards Johan's mound. Johan had his next arrow trained on the lead spear Dane and saw it sink into his heart. Feral roars filled the night as 3 spear Danes closed the distance. Pulling back beyond the mound, Johan dropped his bow and drew his sword and long knife. He waited just outside the firelight, for when they came into darkness, his sword swept low, smashing the ankle of the first Dane, who fell face forward. Next, his kidney suffered the bite of Johan's long knife, as he writhed in the grass like an eel. The last 2 spear Danes stumbled upon their foe, readying weapons as the ranger rolled away, back into the brush. Thrusting their spears to root him out, they prodded until one cried, his body falling forward as his heel was sliced open. Johan rose before the final spear Dane, flicking his blades out to either side. The Dane snarled, charging ahead with a spear lunge that Johan parried with both blades. However, the Dane's shoulder blasted him in the face and nearly bowled him over. Off balance, Johan could do nothing as the Dane grabbed him. And a moment before, the Dane started to beat him barehanded. The blows kept falling, and Johan felt his teeth loosen. He bit off part of his tongue. Warm blood filled his mouth, and the sickening smack of the Dane's fists on his face registered only as if from far away. Then they stopped, and he felt the Dane slump over him. Johan tried to open his eyes, but they were nearly swollen shut. He glimpsed Elisa, holding a seeks that dripped red. She helped him to his feet, and he nearly told her she should have stayed hidden, but held his tongue. They peered out at their hall, which was now in ruin, its roof half collapsed, and smoke hazing the stars above. The brother Axe-Danes had gone into the night. Elisa ran to the burning structure, crying out for her children. They heard nothing in response, and did what they could to peel back timbers, but the inferno burned their skin. They watched for the next few hours as the hall collapsed completely. There was no response from Wenlock. In the valley below their hall, they could see the village was burning as well. 3. 4 years passed. Johan sat at council. The bear fur cloak lay across his shoulders, now pinned with a brass brooch carved with a cross. It signified his new status as Reeve of Wenlock. Around him, the voices of villagers rang against his ears, and he looked blankly upon them, once so eager to help. Now that the power was his, and along with it a new world of rules and limitations, he was more reluctant than ever to offer aid. What could be given to one farmer who'd lost a lamb to Welsh raiders must be taken from a guardsman who patrolled the streets at night. Oftentimes, Johann felt it was best to do nothing, to let things stand as they were, to eke out a living amongst Welsh, greedy West Saxons, and Danes. The 4 years had taught him that when you do not provoke wolves, they are less wont to tear out your throat. A trimming of the herd was necessary, and the reeve rarely suffered winter's bite. Though their talk fell on his ears like rain on walls of stone, some sounds did make it through to his brain, which was wishing it were pickled in ale by this hour. Now that it was April, there should have been talk of May Day preparations, but instead there was talk of war. In December, Danish warlord Guthrum had caught King Alfred of Wessex unawares, chasing him out of Chippenham, and using it as a fort for further raiding. Now King Alfred, who hid in the swamps of Somerset, called all Christians of England to one last battle against the pagan Danes. Some villagers wanted to fight, to avenge those who had died 4 years previous in the Danish raid that burned Moorhall, much of Wenlock, and the Abbey of St. Milberga. The town had suffered greatly, as before it had served as an important pilgrimage site, but without the abbey it was nothing but a dangerous frontier backwater. Johann had fought 4 years to restore the abbey, and now that renovations were finally coming together and the warmth of spring was upon them, men were being asked to leave and die on a remote southern battlefield. Though the reeve had fought against Danes attacking his own hall, he could not send poorer men to their deaths. Passing from the council and suffering the sneers of men who wanted to fight, Johann found his father-in-law waiting for him outside. The slim, gray-haired elder fingered a jeweled sword at his belt and tipped his chin up at Johann as they met eyes. "Harvest must have come early to your house, Johann, while your people finish winter's rations." Alderman Eldwine snorted, wiping mud from his boots. The main road was rutted and wet, wagon wheels and horse hooves sinking into Wenlock's April slurry. "Alderman," Johann coughed, straightening his back as farmers poured from the meeting hall on either side of him. Eldwine and his bodyguards, well-built Saxons armored in chainmail, eyed him warily. "To what do we owe the pleasure of your visit?" "Gloucester is in ashes," Eldwine grunted. "You may have heard. And now that fool Alfred is asking good Mercian folk to die for him in Wessex. We are making the rounds to all townships to discourage such sentiment." "Have no fear, good Eldwine," Johann waved off the concern. "I have already decided to refuse the call, and of course we will not be marching unless you permit it." "Good little Johann. I know you are a young reeve, and Wenlock is a fringe village. Governance can be difficult. I trust my daughter has given you no small amount of aid, and remember to refer to me as Alderman Eldwine." "Right so, Alderman. Your daughter is ever a source of inspiration to me. She is my guiding light." "As she should be. She'll keep the clouds out of your head. What a rise! From woodsman on the heath to reeve on the common, she must be proud." "We remain humble servants of the people, and she keeps me more humble than most." "See that you stay that way." Eldwine fixed Johann with one last disapproving appraisal before turning with his bodyguards to visit the local tavern. Johann groaned, planning on visiting the tavern himself, but now he would have to go home sober. Johann made his way from the common row up to the house he built on a rise, with small blue cornflowers starting to bloom all around. It was not Moorhall, but it was a fine home of broad timbers and thatch that he built with help from villagers who were glad to give him a home within the town. He hoped their feeling had not changed in 4 years. Elisa was waiting in the dooryard, tying an arrowhead to its shaft. She bolted up from the stump she sat on. "Johann," she cried, throwing toned arms around him, Her grip was like iron, and she nearly squeezed the breath from his barrel chest. Seems you've gained all the muscle I lost, Johan laughed. Elisa frowned in response, narrowing her eyes upon him. Her father's luck had been bad enough. Your father is in town. He reminded me not to answer Alfred's summons, which I had already decided against. Father, Elisa sighed. He just wants us to be safe, but he cannot know how we've suffered, our children. We can have others. Johan ran his fingers along Elisa's back. We've tried and failed. Tears rolled down Elisa's cheeks. All of them come back unformed. God's work unfinished. God wants us to have children, and we shall have them. What of the children we lost? Should they not be avenged? Johan choked a cough, moving inside the house to grab a skin of wine and return to the argument. Dousing his dry throat and wiping his lips, he began to reply. Then he saw a cloaked rider on the road up the rise. Elisa grabbed her longbow off a hook, fitting an arrow to it before Johan could scramble up against the house. Shaky fingers pulled a seeks from his boot, which he perched above his shoulder, ready to throw. Dread gripped him, blood beating in his ears. For all the trappings of office he had squandered these past 4 years, if he could not protect his family. As the rider came into view, Johan let out a breath. The rider's face was familiar, and not that of a Dane. 4. Hail, good Reeve, called a voice from the road. It came from a short but well-muscled warrior in a leather jerkin who carried a sword on each hip. The man's face was tanned from the road and marked with scars, but lighted with a warm smile. Johan approached, extending his hand in greeting once the warrior had dismounted. The man knocked his hand away and embraced him in a hug. Ethelred, it is good to see you, Johan managed, as air was forced from his lungs once more. Johan, you've grown. Ethelred paused, finding the word. I know, I'm fat, Johan growled, but you've not come to remind me of that. No, let us speak inside. The men went inside, and Elisa heated them venison stew over a fire while they sat and drank wine. You can afford this fine red now that you're a reeve. From Francia, is it? Ethelred laughed, tossing his mane of black hair. Johan leaned back in his chair, looking at him expectantly. I've come to recruit you to Alfred's cause, a cause all Christians should support. We cannot let these bastard Danes run across our country, burning our halls, raping our women, and enslaving our children. It has to end. Before all of England becomes Daneland, we must unite under Alfred's banner in Wessex. It is the only way forward. Elisa stopped her dinner preparations to look Ethelred calmly in the eye. He cracked a grin, moving his elbows onto the table. Your woman knows it, and all self-respecting Saxons know it too. There's no life for us under the Danish boot heel. No God-fearing Christian would bow to pagans. The ealdorman has, Johan muttered, and he demands that we follow suit. I cannot give you men. He would brand us traitors, and our lands would be seized. Is that the way of it? Weasel shits. He is your own father, Elisa. Surely you can say something. Surely you can agree we must fight. I do, Elisa set the bubbling pot of thick brown on the table. Johan stared at her through its steam. Her hands were on her hips, and now there could be no arguing. I won't let my children have died for nothing. The raids must stop. Alfred wants to give it one last fight. Who are we to stand by while good Christians die to lawless pagans? They need us, and I, for one, will fight. You would leave me in this hall I built for you? Johan stammered. The village. I told you to become reeve, to protect the people, to hunt more than wolves. You've grown fat, enjoying their labor, eating venison that you did not catch. Where is the Johan I married, the one who never walked from a fight, who cared nothing for the words of my father? We have a good life here. You would have us throw it away at war? I would have us build a better life for all Christians and a safer life for our children by ridding England of pagans. Ethelred turned his dark eyes on Johan, feeling his resolve weaken. There are many villagers who would fight, Johan allowed, but they do not know how, and I've lost my way as well. I fought in the shield hall at Ashdown, alongside Alfred's West Saxons, Ethelred said proudly. Alfred is a good man, and his army is strong. It would be my honor to train Wenlock's men, and you. And after tonight, Elisa smiled, no more wine and venison. You're not the farmer I knew 10 years ago, Johan said breathlessly as he struggled to keep his pine shield up under a hammering of Ethelred's sword. They trained in a field miles outside town, so as to avoid suspicion. 40 farmers stood with wooden clubs and shields of their own, waiting to be battered by Ethelred. I suppose I'm not, Ethelred shook sweat from his hair. Too long on the road. I've become a man of hills and caves, fighting whatever battle needs to be fought, resting my head under the stars. It's not a bad life. You used to be the same. I never rode England seeking glory, leading honest men to their deaths in distant lands. You make it sound so dramatic. And so romantic, too, Ethelred chuckled, kicking Johan's feet out from under him and prodding his sword up under the wreath's chin. Next! The farmers could not suppress a round of laughter as Johan rose, brushing off dirt and moving back to join their ranks. After they had been soundly defeated in single combat by the warrior Ethelred, who seemed never to tire of energy, they were formed up in opposing shield walls. 20 men on each side fit their shields together, so that they overlapped an inch. Then they slowly marched toward one another. They were encouraged to spit, sling insults, slam clubs on shields, and do anything necessary to terrify the man on the other side of the shield wall. When they closed the gap, the men pushed their shields with all their might, trying to topple the man on the other side. At the same time, club blows rained down on their heads if they did not duck low enough. Once the shield wall broke, it was a free-for-all of club beatings that rendered many unconscious. Johan returned to Elisa that night, in a similar condition to how she found him that eve outside Moorhall, bruised, jaw loosened, and mouth bleeding. She went to work immediately, tending his wounds with poultices and bandages, and laying him in bed for an early night's sleep. He ate stewed carrots, onion, cabbage, and parsnips. There was, however, no wine or venison. After a month of training, Johan had lost 2 stone weight, and the 40 men of Wenlock somewhat resembled warriors. Before heading south, Johan emptied the town's coffers to buy them all swords and horses. They departed under cover of nightfall, 2 weeks before Ascension Day, when Alfred had demanded all Christians gather at Egbert's Stone in Wessex. On the road south, they donned simple woolen robes and pretended to be monks, having visited Wenlock on a pilgrimage to its still-ruined abbey. A great shock to Johan and mild disappointment to Ethelred, they encountered no ealdormen, bandits, or Danes on the road south to Gloucester. After 1 week, they looked upon the shattered halls of the once great city. Johan stood a hill on a white workhorse beside Elisa on a dappled mare. She demanded to ride south with the men, and because Johan was not able to defeat her in single combat, she had her way. "What will we find in that ruin?" she asked. "You should not have come," Johan grumbled. "War is no place for women. We'll find a town with no young men, few good-looking women, and many elders, I imagine. But we've come all this way. Let us go and see." 5. The company made their way south down the hill and into the city. A charred gate stood over the road, but there were no guards, and not a soul looked out at them. As they entered the empty city, Many buildings were still blackened, reeking of ash and death. Rats ran in waves across their feet, darting from skeleton to skeleton that still clung with rancid meat. Bodies filled the streets. None had come to take them away, and there was little sign of Danes. No voices could be heard, only the moaning of wind on a gray and dismal day in May. Back home they would be celebrating May Day, singing and dancing on the common, to the tune of pipes and drums. Oat cakes and meat pies would be in the oven, and children's faces would be filled with laughter and smiles. Johan shook away these thoughts as he led his wife, old friend Athelred, and 40 wayward farmers on their fool's errand. "If no one is here, we should take the finest inn, free of charge, I suppose," Athelred offered. "They are here," Johan muttered. "They are hiding. I pray only there are no Danes left." "They would have gone to join Guthrum by now. We have only a week till Ascension Day. Let us rest and be off to Egbert's Stone in the morning." The group, still wearing the drab robes of wandering monks, finally reached the town center, crossing River Severn. St. Peter's Abbey had been gutted with flame, hollow and dark within. A large inn with a swaying sign that read "Swineherd's Pint" beckoned to them across the town common. On the common, it seemed some sort of defense had been staged, for the ground was rutted from boot heels, and broken arrows lay beside the odd hand or arm. It was a feast of rats, and no different once Johan pushed open the door of the inn. A rush of the black creatures swarmed their legs, pouring out into the streets, and a fetid smell rose to their noses. A bartender, reduced to bones, laid on the floor behind the bar, and a few patrons, similarly picked clean, sat chairs and sprawled on tables, moving to the rear of the tavern. Picking their way over a crusted, blood-stained floor, they found the door to the storeroom. Inside they found bags of carrots and potatoes that had not completely spoiled. The men spent the rest of the day clearing corpses from the hall, and mopping floors with water from a well on the common. Surprisingly, the well was not choked with blood and rot, only a little soil, and tasted clean enough. The Danes had taken all the ale from the inn and surrounding buildings, and in their search the company found no survivors. In the tavern hearth, a cauldron was scrubbed, and Elisa used it to make a carrot and potato stew for the men. There was even some lard they found from a butcher shop to add some flavor, but the meat had been ransacked as well. The men spread out in the tavern, eagerly awaiting their stew as Elisa made the rounds. Johan settled back in his seat, thinking their reception to Gloucester could have been much worse. He was about to raise his mug of dirty water to Athelred, and a toast to "No Danes," when he heard a scratching from behind the bar. Johan rose, hand on the hilt of his sword. Athelred rose with him, downing his mug of water and nearly choking in the process. The reeve signaled back to his friend to be quiet as he rounded the bar and looked down at where the sound had come from. On the floor, beneath a rotten sack of potatoes, he now noticed the outline of a hidden door. Gripping its edges, he pulled but gained no purchase. Ethelred drew his sword, a fine blade with a silver grip and topaz pommel, then nudged its tip under the door's edge. Straining with his considerable strength, Ethelred groaned, provoking a worried call from Elisa across the room. In a flurry of movement, Ethelred flew back into the bar, his sword prying the door open. Kneeling to look down into its dark depths, the two men gazed upon small, bright eyes and bone-thin, mud-stained faces. "Who is there?" Johan demanded, drawing his sword. "Show yourselves, or we're coming down." "We're children," said a boy's voice. "No grown-ups down here. We don't trust them." Johan craned his neck to look at the three children better, noticing a familiar look about the boy and two girls. "What are your names?" he breathed, setting his sword down. "We said we don't trust grown-ups. Go away now. We're not coming up there." "You're starving, boy," Johan spat. "You'd best come up, or you and those girls are going to die down there. If the hunger doesn't get you, the rats will." "We've been down here seems like years now," the boy said dreamily. "We'll last a little longer until the Dane masters return." "Dane masters? You are slaves to them?" "Yes. They feed us well, and let us run in the fields as long as we work hard. They're not so bad." "A Saxon should not be slave to a Dane. I am here to kill the Danes, and will start by freeing you. Now come up, we have dinner." The boy raised his face to the light. Brown hair hung over his forehead and ears. His nose twitched, and he snarled. "I'm Johan, and these are Ewan and Quen." The girls squealed at being named. "Come on up, girls. If these men are weak, we'll help the Danes kill them. I won't go another night without food." "You made a wise choice." Johan helped the boy of the same name up, looking into his eyes and hoping for recognition, but seeing none. "My son." 6. When the children saw their mother, they started to cry immediately. However, it still took them several hours to accept that these were their parents, and to eat the food that was offered. Elisa wept longer and harder than the children, and could do little but clutch them to her breast through the night. Once he had been washed, and given the robes of a monk to replace his rotted, soiled clothes, little Johann sat on an inn's room bed before his father. The elder Johann stood and paced. "It's been 4 years," Johann said. "You're 10 years old. It's so big and so bold now. It is a blessing you survived. I am proud to call you my son." Little Johann's eyes stayed locked on the floor, his feet swaying on the bed, his jaw clenched, but he showed no reaction. "How long were you in the cellar?" "It must have been a week. I lost track of time. The Knutsons left us with some oats and told us to stay. The door got stuck. We had no choice." "The Knutsons," Johann growled. "That was the name of the brother Axdanes who took you that night." "Yes. They were Ubba's Raven Danes, but he is dead now." "Where have they gone?" "To Guthrum, at Chippenham. Guthrum is forming an army of all Danes and Saxons who will bow to him. He will crush Alfred soon." "You hear much for a slave." "Slaves to Danish gold-givers see many great men. I keep my ears open. None suspect a slave to remember such things." "And because you are raised Saxon and know we must defeat these men, you listened well." "Why have you come, father?" little Johann asked, his blue eyes lancing up. "As I said, I have come to kill Danes. Chief amongst them is Guthrum. Once his great heathen army is gone, Mercia will be safer. Our children will be their slaves no more." Tears crept down little Johann's cheeks for the first time, and he sniffed before falling forward and sobbing on his father's chest. "Where are we going, father?" asked Quen, light of eye and hair like her mother. "We are going to Egbert's Stone. You will be safe there, guarded by the swords of Wessex. We will fight a great battle, and finally be freed of the Danes." "Father, Harald and Eric are not evil men." "They took you from us," Elisa scolded her child. "You'll never get those 4 years back, and neither will we." "We're strong now," little Johann piped up, wielding his spoon like a sword. They ate leftover stew that morning. "The Danes lived differently, and we saw much, more than most children our age. I'm ready to fight now, father. I know what the Danes stole from us, and I want to kill them too." "You are a pup," Johann said with gray, unchanging eyes. "You will remain with your mother and the girls. Someone must keep them safe." "Are we ready?" Ethelred popped his head into the tavern, the other men having assembled outside. "Let us go," said Johann, rising to his feet. Little Johann rode with his father, and the girls rode with Elisa, as the company moved out from the town center through the gates. Only once they had gone did the ghosts of Gloucester emerge to observe their passing. The company moved south, crossing the green, fertile valleys of Wessex. After 2 days, they arrived at Cirencester, camping outside the city under limestone hills, in the fields of a friendly shepherd, eating his mutton. Another 2 days brought them within sight of Chippenham, where Alfred had nearly lost his life to Guthrum. The Danes had long kept the fortress as a base for raiding, but they saw no banners or army cook fires. The countryside seemed abandoned, not a single trader or farmer risking the highways at that time. However, footprints on the road leading south spoke of grave danger, and Johann estimated at least 4,000 men. Finally, they reached Wiltshire's white hills of chalk, and the rise to Egbert Stone. The monument itself was a humble cluster of grey rock, but the men assembled all around were awe-inspiring. Men stood armed with great golden-hilted swords, long spears of ash, and armored with resplendent chainmail. Flying on an overlook above was the green dragon banner of Wessex, King Alfred's symbol. Ethelred led them straight to the camp of a West Saxon lord, who he greeted with his customary warm embrace. "Osric," he cried, "it's been too long since we killed Danes together." "That it has, little Ethelred," beamed the lord, blond mustaches hanging below his chin. "Your arms are thicker than tree limbs. You've been training, haven't you?" "Well, yes. Have you not?" "Of course I have. My men, however, have spilled more fish guts than Dane guts. A damned shame." "We will have to make up for that, then." "Ale?" Ethelred took the lord by the shoulder, and they moved to his great deer-hide tent. "Ah," he turned back, "I almost forgot. This is Johan of Moorhall. He has come with his family, newly rejoined in the ruins of Gloucester, to slay Danes. He's brought 40 men that I trained myself." "This one could slay a Dane at 60 yards. Osric looked over Elisa before setting eyes on her husband. "Johann, it is. Well met. You're welcome to fight with my men tomorrow. We've sighted Guthrum outside Eddington. We march before dawn. I trust you've said your prayers." "Prayers?" Johann asked. "Last rites. All men should have them before battle. Go see my priest. His name is Pirlig. He may be drunk, but he's a good man, and thorough." 7. They woke in the early morning, marching joylessly all day to make camp for the night in a valley south of Eddington. So soon rejoined, what had he brought his family into? Yet, as the sun peeked through, Johann knew this land of Wessex was truly blessed by God. Life sprang from every possible place. Farmers watched Alfred's great army pass, not believing their eyes. Sheep looked out from their folds, as hills gleamed like emeralds in the sun. In this place they slept one last time, and Johann wondered if he needed a second last rites. Next morning they woke, leaving the women, children, and supply train a half-mile behind in the valley. Johann said a solemn goodbye to Elisa and kissed her on the cheek. The army marched to the foot of a great hill where they could look upon Guthrum's army. 3,000 men of Wessex arrayed at the foot of the hill, while 5,000 Danes gathered at its top, defending a green, earthen fortress of ditches and mounds. The Danes were long-haired, tattooed, shrieking, and Johann could smell ale on their breath 1,000 yards away. Atop that hill were the Knudsen brothers, and Johann would see them dead. The king appeared to them then, standing at the vanguard's center, beside his banner. Shoulder-length black hair, parted in the middle, beneath a golden jeweled crown. He wore a coat bearing St. George's cross over mail that shone like the sun. "Saxons, you have come at my call to kill these bastard Danes. Long have we suffered beneath their boots. Long have our women and children suffered the yoke of slavery. Now the time is at hand. We must prove to them their gods are false, and ours is true. We will take what they've taken from us. They will know the bite of Saxon steel. Take their lives, take their gold. Let their blood stain this earth. Drawing his sword, he spurred them up the hill to meet destiny. Johan guided his men into Osric's formation, joining the edges of their shields to form the wall that would move slowly, perilously up to face the Danes. As they approached the enemy line, they noticed before them were not Danes, but Saxons. Wulfhere, the gray-bearded and well-respected ealdorman of Wiltshire, stood amongst the Danes, his beard raised to do their devil's work. Osric spat on the ground, thumping sword against shield as he rallied his men to spill traitors' blood. Athelred stood at Johan's right hand, their shields locked as they ascended the hill. Osric's 1,000 men advanced on the 2,000 Wiltshire men and Danes who sat the hill outside the fort. Guthrum's main force of 3,000 remained within the walls of the earthen fortress. Johan wondered why Guthrum hid, and thanked God that Alfred moved his household warriors up to protect against any sortie by Guthrum's men. Even with Alfred's flank protecting Osric's men from the main force, they were outnumbered 2-1. However, as Osric's men advanced and their lord screamed like a man possessed, their shield wall slammed with fury against that of the Danes. The front row was armed with long knives to do the brutal, close-quarters work of gutting Danes with their ale breath in your mouth. Blows rained down upon their heads as they struggled to hold the pine boards straight and tall. An axe from the Danish second row cleaved the face of the man to Johan's left, a space which was soon filled by another Wenlock man. It was madness to lead farmers against Danes, he thought. What had he been thinking? Then, as a long knife tore into his thigh, the rage devoured him. Johan plunged his long knife forward past his shield, skewering a Dane between the ribs. Then, as Johan bent his elbow, he stabbed up over his shield and down between the faceplates of a Dane on the other side. Ethelred scored his long knife through a Dane's kneecap, felling him backward to break his own shield wall. Saxons poured into the gap, drawing swords to kill the Danes at will. Seeing the Danes break before him, Wulfhere called out to Osric for mercy. Osric ushered him forward, for his men to shelter behind his shield wall. However, as Wulfhere approached, Osric slashed him across the throat and spat in his face. Osric then showed mercy, stepping aside to let Wulfhere's Saxons pass behind his shield wall to escape slaughter. The traitors of Wiltshire did so, yet Osric's men, who reluctantly opened their shield wall, soon felt regret. Danish horsemen trampled the Wiltshire men and broke through Osric's line. Now there were horses and Danes above them, hacking down with animal ferocity. Saxons fell to the onslaught, and soon Osric sounded retreat down the side of the hill. Alfred called out to them to hold, but they would not listen. Osric's farmers would not face horse Danes. Johan and Athelred did not retreat, however. They ran ahead to dodge the spears and swords of the horsemen as they cut down their riders. The 40 men of Wenlock locked the shield wall behind them, raising spears to keep the horses at bay. Then Johan saw a raven tattoo encircling the pale eyes of one horseman. "Eric Knutson!" Johan called, slamming sword against shield. The rider spurred, with no great recognition, merely another Saxon to be killed is what he saw, charging toward Johan with spear leveled. Johan's shield accepted the spearhead, while punching through to jab his shoulder. Twisting away, the reeve drove his sword up into the Dane's hamstring. Bellowing in fury, the rider cantered past, but came to a halt and slumped in his saddle. Johan pulled the seeks from his belt and threw it end over end, spinning through the air to pierce the Dane between his shoulder blades. Johan was there when the Dane hit the earth, his sword slamming down into the space of his spine. Johan roared as he twisted the blade, spraying his boots with blood. Ethelred called to him, and after another moment's grim satisfaction, Johan returned to the line. Osric's men and the defected men of Wiltshire formed up with them as well, pushing the horsemen back. Stunned at the resistance and seeing their leader fall, the horsemen now fled the hilltop, moving down its steep edge, barely keeping their riders. Johan screamed at the one he knew must be Harald Knutson, the tattooed Dane, with a scar on the side of his neck, where an arrow had pierced through. 8. Thank you, men, for standing with me. Johan raised his sword to the 40 farmers of Wenlock. Their faces were bloody, bodies filthy, and their weapons covered in gore. He could not be sure, but it appeared he had not lost many men. Only half of Osric's men have returned to the fight. The rest were missing, and so is Osric himself. Rain started to fall, and wind swept over the hill, chilling them in their wool and hide armor. Yet there were smiles on their faces as they pumped swords in response and tapped them against shields. Though this day is still not won, we must breach that fort to end the Danes. You've proven yourselves true warriors of England, true soldiers of God. Now let us finish his work and banish these beasts from our lands. Wenlock's 40 men, joined by Osric's remaining 500, Alfred's 1,000, and the 1,000-man reserve of Lord Wiglaf, assembled before Guthrum's fort. The Danish warlord had 3,000 men inside, defended by its earthen walls. Johan knew all Danes were trained killers, not farmers and shepherds. 4 Danes were worth 1 Saxon at times. However, today they had proven the Danes wrong, and the Reeve hoped their luck would last. White mists obscured the fortress, and the chill wetness settled into his bones. The fort had earthen walls 10 feet high, with ditches 10 feet deep, making the walls 20 feet of slick mud to climb. Water was pooling in the troughs of the ditches now, which would make their progress even harder, and the job of javelineers that much easier. Spear Danes and axe Danes looked down on them from every possible angle on the walls. "Long swords, spears, and shields, boys!" came a call from somewhere behind that Johan could not place. The advice was good enough, however, and he equipped himself as such. "Not too late to turn back," Ethelred offered to Johan. "Never," Johan grunted, "but I must ask, what happened to your good Lord Osric? He seems to have fled the field and left half his men." "It's not like him," Ethelred frowned, gripping a spear and shield, "but war reveals us our true selves. Perhaps he's soured to battle over the years. Not all men can be mad like us." "I had never known the battle joy." Johan's voice grew quiet, contemplative. "It is a thing that takes over completely. It cannot be denied. And now I know there is no other thing that comes close. While facing death, we truly live." "Well said, my friend." Ethelred smiled bleakly. His exuberance was gone now, under the mist, his face silver and silent. "We march to death's rhythm." Johan hefted a spear to his shoulder. "Let's not keep God waiting." "I never knew you to be a religious man, Johan." "Never was, but this is making me think it's the best thing for me. A man who loves battle so much should be kept from it. I can't wander battlefields the rest of my days as you do. I've got a family after all." "There's that. May you live a long and happy life after today, Johan." The men of Mercia and Wessex advanced on the ditches in a wedge formation. Danes in their shield wall called down to them with familiar insults of whoreson and arsling. They must have learned the words in English just to incite rage in their foes. Screaming for England, Johan and his men raised shields to shoulders and descended the ditch. A volley of javelins clunked against his shield and jabbed his foot as Saxons fell to left and right. The 10-foot drop left him in 2 feet of water that soaked his legs and slowed his march. Overhead, Danish and Saxon archers struggled to fire on one another as wet bowstrings lost all strength. Johan pressed on, planting boots into the 20-foot wall of mud. At the top of the wall, the Danes were waiting. When he had risen halfway, they attacked. Spears angled around his shield to dig into his shoulder and scrape his hip. He lunged his spear forward, shattering one Dane's ankle, but soon lost footing and slid back down the wall. Ethelred was still up there, and Danish spears crisscrossed over his defense. An axe came over the top and pulled his shield down so that a spear pierced his gut. The warrior cried out as he fell back into the ditch with a great splash. Johan was at his side, gripping his comrade by the hand and helping him to stand. Ethelred coughed a handful of blood as his fingers clawed at the wall to rise up again. Johan looked him over uncertainly, not knowing if he could make it up. Then a javelin took a piece of Johan's ear, and he moved his shield back in place, covering himself and Ethelred. The warrior pushed past Johan's shield and struggled up the rise again. Johan gritted his teeth, pumping his legs as he rose alongside his friend, beating him to the top. When he looked over the rise, he glimpsed Dane's breaking formation, moving back within the hill fort. Johan reached the top and knelt to pull Ethelred up by his shoulders. The dark-haired warrior collapsed, looking down the line as the Danes broke and fled. "What is happening?" Johan breathed. "The bastards are scared." Ethelred rose up, running after them. Johan gave chase. They met a line of panicked Danes at the rear wall of the fortress, where many had already jumped the walls and fled down the steep far side. From their right, they saw the rush of 500 Saxons, bloodied and maddened with roars of fury as they charged. It was Lord Osric and his farmers who had broken earlier. They circled around the enemy line to ascend the steepest part of the hill and attack where the wall was shortest. Attacked on two sides, Guthrum had ordered the retreat. Now Alfred had risen from the ditch, and his household warriors, silvery West Saxons in war splendor, hacked into the rear guard of the Danes. Then the king gave the order to chase them downhill and run them to their hole in the north. Johan looked around, tears in his eyes. Saxons raised swords in cheer and repeated one word over and over again: "England!" Elisa and little Johan came to their father after the battle. The Danish horsemen who had broken on the hill had attacked them at the supply train. Elisa had a scar along her cheek, and little Johan walked with a limp. The girls followed behind, their eyes wide with fear. As a furious Johan bent to inspect them, little Johan raised a black, dripping bundle to his father's eyes. Opening the bundle, Johan looked into the pale eyes of Harald Knudsen. "So, you are a little warrior," Johan tousled his boy's hair. "Yes, father. He saw me and dismounted. He was furious. I held my shield firm and stuck him like a pig," said the boy excitedly. "Mother did strike him with an arrow first," he admitted. "You are not alone on the battlefield today, my love," Elisa said, rubbing mud from her husband's cheek. Johan knelt at their sides, wrapping arms around his family and saying a prayer to God. Saxons pursued Guthrum and his men as far as Chippenham, slaughtering them on the way. Ethelred marched with the men to besiege Chippenham, but died of his wounds soon after. 2 weeks later, starving under siege, Guthrum surrendered. Guthrum was baptized a Christian in 878, and Wessex and western Mercia were freed of Danish rule by treaty. It was the start of Alfred's work, and what would one day become the nation of England.